Hello and welcome to the Hay Festival Book of the Month for this month of March. My name is Martina Stevis-Gridneff. I'm the New York Times Brussels correspondent, and I'm here today to talk with Minouche Shafik about her book, What We Owe Each Other, which is the Hay Festival Book of the Month for March. Just have a few housekeeping notes to share with everyone before we dive into our conversation with Minouche. First of all, I really want to invite you to submit any questions through the Q&A function in your browser, and we'll make sure we'll leave ample time for Minouche to address those. I hope to get as many questions from the audience as possible, so please don't wait, keep them coming. You can buy this book on the Hay Festival website, or of course at a local bookstore. And if you want to donate to the Hay Festival, you can do so online on their website as well. The Hay Festival Book of the Month for the month of April next month is Male Tears by the author Benjamin Myers, with a live Q&A on the 27th of April. And you can register as well for that event on the Hay Festival website. Now, I'm just going to give you a brief introduction of our author tonight, Minouche Shafik, and get to the conversation. Minouche Shafik was born in Egypt and migrated as a child to the United States of America. She currently serves since 2017 as the director of the London School of Economics and Political Science. She moved to the UK later in life for postgraduate studies in economics, and at 36, she became the youngest vice president in the history of the World Bank. She's since held prominent policymaking positions in development and other fields of economic, especially policymaking, including at the British International Development, the International Department, the Department for International Development, known as DFID, as well as serving as a deputy governor of the Bank of England. In those roles, she's observed as a policymaker big inflection points in recent history that have affected our world profoundly, from the fall of the Berlin Wall to the Arab Spring. And she's done so from vantage points across the world, both in Africa, in Europe, and gone through policymaking during the Eurozone and the global financial crisis, the crash of 2008. Following her appointment as director of the London School of Economics in 2017, Minouche launched a program of research known as Beveridge 2.0 to rethink the welfare state for the 21st century. And a lot of our conversation tonight will focus around that and the unspoken contract between people and state that underpins this welfare state. She was made a Dame in the Queen's Birthday Honours List of 2015, and in 2020, she was appointed a crossbench peer in the House of Lords. Without further ado, I want to invite Minouche to start having what's bound to be a really interesting conversation in this extremely difficult time. And I guess I'll start with a brief background of the premise of the book and let Minouche talk about the inception a bit more. Minouche, in the introduction of the book, you talk about the conditions that have made a new social contract, this the relationship of what we owe each other, that really necessitated, and it feels like the coronavirus pandemic just catalyzes this need that percolated around the global financial crisis of 2008. Can you talk a little bit more about why a new social contract is so necessary, and maybe just give our audience a sense of what the main pillars of this new social contract should be?
Very good. Well, thank you so much, Martina, and it's a real pleasure to be here. The genesis of this book really started in 2016 when I was trying to understand why people in so many societies were angry. And that was manifested in political polarization, inequality, the culture wars, the climate strikes. And this was a universal phenomenon. 4 out of 5 people across the world said the system wasn't working for them. And I wanted to understand what that came from, especially because I had spent more than 20 years of my career in international development focused on making poverty history. And the truth is that humans have really never had it so good in terms of living standards. And yet there was all this disappointment. And so that was the genesis. But as you said, in some ways, then the pandemic came. And the pandemic, in many ways, revealed the fault lines in our societies even more. And you could tell by who suffered the most. It was the old, the sick, those in precarious work, women, those from ethnic minorities. And those fundamental inequalities in our societies were made even more apparent. And so the more I thought about it, the more I realized that what was driving that dissatisfaction in our societies was the fact that people felt that they were owed more and that they had a growing sense of insecurity and a lack of opportunity. And what do I mean by the social contract? I mean the rules that define what we owe each other in society and how we organize the delivery of those obligations. For example, do we raise children at home by mothers or grandparents, or does society provide childcare centers or paid parental leave so that both parents can raise children? Do we expect employers to provide contracts with regular hours, such as sick leave and pensions, or do we expect individuals to carry the risks of unemployment and sickness? Do we expect a healthcare system which covers some of our illnesses, or do we expect individuals to carry those risks? All of those decisions are part of our social contract. And the hypothesis of the book is that it's broken. And it's broken for two reasons. One, the changing role of women, that women are no longer, because they're educated and working, our old social contract assumed they would take care of the young and the old for free, and that's difficult. And second, because of technology, and technology's changed the nature of work dramatically. And those are the two big drivers. Going forward, there are two more factors that I think are putting huge pressure on our social contract. Aging, and the fact that we live so much longer and need to think about what happens as we get older. And second, of course, is climate change, which is challenging the sustainability of our economic model.
Thank you. And I just want to pick on something that you mentioned that really struck me when I started reading the book is this discrepancy between our perception of our well-being, that people from the very rich world here in Europe, where I am and you are, all the way to America, to the emerging economies such as China and India, just don't feel that they're getting what they deserve. And yet the empirical evidence shows that we've kind of never had it so good in a lot of ways. And so I wonder if we can unpick a little bit why that may be, and to what extent what goes into that sentiment is a more complex set of expectations.
Absolutely. So I think the disappointment stems from expectations, for sure. One of the most striking polls I've seen is that in every advanced economy today, people think their children will be worse off than their parents. That's not true in emerging markets. In developing countries, most people expect their children to be better off than them. But in the advanced economies, people's expectations about the future have gotten much more pessimistic. I think the other thing is that while living standards may have gone up for many people in recent decades, insecurity has also gone up. And so people may have a job, but it may be on a flexible contract, and they may not know how many hours they're going to work. And they may be very unsure about how they're going to support themselves in their old age because they have a pension scheme that's not very generous. And I think that insecurity is a really important part of why we see so much anxiety. I think the other side is that the nature of opportunity has changed. And many people feel, not only do they feel insecure, but their prospects are much worse. And why do I say that? For example, social mobility has actually declined in many countries over recent decades. Another really striking statistic is how long does it take in different countries to go from the lowest part of the income distribution to the middle? So in the UK and the US, it takes 5 generations. In Denmark, it takes 2 generations. So you can move up to the middle class quite quickly. In countries like Brazil or South Africa or Colombia, it can take 9 generations, which means you have no hope in any conceivable lifetime or awareness that you're aware of improving your lot. And I think that fall in social mobility is a huge source of anger in many societies today.
That's really interesting. And it feeds into my next question, which through your career and your experience in policymaking and studying the outcomes of policies, as well as the nature of the problems you're trying to address, and you do this very kind of elegantly and clearly in the book, it's clear that there are policies that work better to solve certain problems that policymakers and societies identify as problems and want to solve. And yet we've seen underpinning a lot of what today might be called culture wars, but I'll just call politics, the nature of the game of politics, especially in the context of very competitive democracies. We're seeing a sort of rise of disinterest in those policies that empirically work, a backlash against what, you know, people might call, or critics might call the technocracy. And I wonder how you think that the empirical knowledge of things that work can be reintroduced into political dialogue and competition in a way that doesn't feel alienating and foreign to the people who feel like the system's not working for them. It seems a real issue, especially in the elections we've seen over the past decade in the developed world, but also in some cases in the developing world as well.
Definitely. So I was thinking the other day, in some ways, I could almost call this book the anti-populist manifesto, because it is a counterpoint to that kind of politics. You know, I think the kind of politics we see in many countries today, which is nationalistic, protectionist, anti-empirical, loaded with identity and culture wars. I think that politics has identified the problem, which is that many people feel left behind. Many people feel they haven't been given a chance. People feel worried about their own futures. They've got the diagnosis right. It's just that the policies they're recommending to solve them are wrong. And so what I tried to do in this book, and I've tried, I hope, to write it in a way that's very accessible. It goes through the stages of life that we all experience, from, you know, as Beveridge would have said, from cradle to grave, from raising children to being educated, to worrying about your health, to working, to growing old, and looks at how our social contract is broken in each of those dimensions. And then looks, and the really technical evidence base is all in the endnotes, but there's a lot of it that's underpinning the arguments. But it tries to show how there are different ways of doing it and how other countries have found better solutions to our social contract. So it is very much a reassertion of the importance of evidence in policymaking. I would like to think that the pandemic has restored some of the credibility of experts. And actually, polling shows that that's the case. Polling shows that trust in experts, in academics and others has actually gone up over the last year relative to politicians, business leaders, civil, media, civil society. And I think even though, of course, many politicians, turn to experts when they tried to figure out how to manage the pandemic, but also I think it's fantastically healthy that the public saw experts disagree. Scientists disagreed with each other, and they could see how these issues are complicated, actually, and there isn't always one point of view. But what's really interesting about the way science and expertise works is that you have to look at the data and you have to subject your views to peer review, and there has to be transparency about where you got your data and why you came to the view you did, and people debate and discuss. And through that process, you get a better outcome and a better decision. And I think having people see that process unfold over the last year, I'm hoping will restore confidence in the importance of having good evidence to inform public policy.
You spoke earlier as well, and I guess it sort of is a natural next step in our conversation about the feeling of insecurity about the future. And that's really something that has been felt very deeply by blue collar workers in the developed world, for example, especially baby boomers and the generation after them. And in your book, one of the big issues you try to tackle is the major disruption of both technology and the measures to mitigate climate change is about to bring to the nature of work and to jobs. And we've seen this play out in the last few decades with manufacturing moving to the developing world in a lot of ways. We saw it already in some fossil fuel related industries, sort of slowly beginning. And you make the convincing, I think, statement in your book that jobs won't sort of disappear. There will be new jobs. I wonder how we tackle the fact that for a lot of people, their jobs will disappear and they will not be able to do the new jobs. That transition, which is so rife with disruption and negative disruption in a lot of ways for this quest for a new social contract.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I think a huge source of the insecurity people feel is that more people are on flexible arrangements, more people are on part-time gig work, arrangements where they are self-employed and don't have steady sources of income. And that's a source of insecurity. And what we see is most people would be actually willing to give up a significant proportion of their income for more security. But that flexibility has come at a significant price, compounded by the issue that you raise, which is automation and technology will change jobs. And I think where our societies have currently proved inadequate is in supporting people to transition to the jobs of the future. And almost every country in the world grossly underinvests in what's called active labor market policies to help people move to new jobs. And particularly when you look at places like the Rust Belt in the US or the north of England or parts of the developing world which were reliant on a single industry, often extractive industries. When those industries fail, those communities die. And it's very, most countries don't deal with that situation well, but there is a better way. You look at, say, the Nordic countries. They have very flexible labor markets. People get hired and fired all the time. In fact, they have the highest labor turnover in Europe. But that is not accompanied by huge anxiety because people get very good unemployment insurance, retraining, and very quickly find new jobs. And that's because they spent a serious amount of money on reskilling workers, and particularly focused on those workers who have the fewest skills and who need the most support. And hundreds of studies around the world have shown if you invest long-term and on a steady basis in reskilling workers and work really closely with employers to make sure that you're developing the skills for the jobs of the future, you can get people back into work and it pays off. And for me, I think work is such an important part of the social contract. It's how we all contribute to society. So enabling people to stay in work is so worth the investment, both for their own dignity, but also because of their financial contribution through taxation and support, paying for their own pensions over the long term. So I think there is a solution out there. It's just that we don't underinvest. We underinvest enough in each other. We need to invest more in each other to keep ourselves, to keep our skills relevant. And that's even more important for this younger generation, whose careers are going to span much longer than older generations. For the older generation, you learned from about age 6 to about 20, 21, 22 or thereabouts. And then those skills lasted you for the rest of your career, which would be about 30 years. For younger people, their careers are going to span 40, 50, maybe even 60 years. And so we need to give them the support and the tools to be able to reskill often.
Interesting. I really invite people who read your book to spend some time with the tables on professions that maybe becoming slightly obsolete. I'm not, no spoilers, but there were some that surprised me. I was happy not to see journalism on them, but
Right.
I just want
Professors
to.
are always going to be employed.
Exactly. Yeah. Just as long as you and I have a job, it's fine. um, but since you mentioned that, I do want to stop a little bit on your chapter on education, because it feels to me like the one topic that you touch on that's sort of the least politically charged, the least contentious, and garners the most sort of cross-spectrum support. The belief in education just cuts across left, right, developing and developed world. And even in the context of the coronavirus crisis and the various measures governments have taken to respond to it, we've seen governments be quite prepared to shut schools down and online learning with very dubious outcomes before touching, let's say, eating out or retail. And that really sort of makes me wonder the true commitment of governments and states across the world to free education, and that kind of mobility and freedom it brings that you say your own father talked to you about as you were leaving Egypt. And I do wonder why quality free education has been so elusive, even in the world's richest, most well-organized countries.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I think the pandemic forced all of us to really appreciate, especially those with children at home who got to experience the horrors of homeschooling, how valuable our school system is and how valuable education is. I think, I'm hoping that experience will put education back front and center on the political agenda. I think one of the points I make in the book is that one of the ways that we can deal with social mobility and the unequal outcomes that we see in our education system is investing much more early, before children even get to school. And traditionally, those early years, let's call them 1 to 3-ish, were seen as the responsibility of families. That wasn't part of the social contract. But more and more evidence that we've seen in recent years has shown that those first 1,000 days of life are actually the most important for brain development. And if children don't get good nutrition or mental stimulation in those early years, no matter how good of a school you put them in, they will never be able to catch up. And so I show in the book many examples of countries that have looked at very low-cost programs that make sure that kids, especially from poorer families, get good nutrition, get mental stimulation. And the payoff is massive. It is the best way to deal with social mobility and the most cost-effective way to deal with social mobility. And I think if young children come to school better prepared to learn, they will do better in school. It will equalize outcomes in terms of school, but also those early years, you're laying the foundations for lifelong learning, and it will develop the kind of cognitive skills, what basically means being able to solve problems and think for yourself, that are what will be highly valued in the labor market. And in those list of jobs that are likely to be the jobs of the future, those kinds of skills are exactly what will be valued in the future.
Right. I wanted to move to another huge pillar in the new social contract that you elaborate on in the book, which is health. And it's such a dividing line in the sort of transatlantic experience between the United States and the UK and the rest of Europe. So much so that it almost feels cultural now rather than strictly technical, bureaucratic, political. And not to try and be too zeitgeisty about it, but I was following the public discourse around the Harry, Meghan, Oprah interview, and one of my favorite threads on Twitter was an American sort of observer had aggregated all the tweets from British people watching the broadcast in the US, who are completely stunned by the prescription medicine advertising in the ad breaks of the interview. And one tweet said, if these medicine ads are what it's like to not have an NHS and never want to experience that. And of course, we've all just been thinking very intensively about the sort of state provision of healthcare because of the coronavirus pandemic. There's been an outpouring of sympathy for people who work in these systems, and we've relied on them for the survival of our loved ones. I wonder if you think that the pandemic will forge a dynamic for a new consensus on state-provided healthcare systems or hybrid systems, and will give them a new lease of life in almost the form that they are today, which has been sort of chipped away at every budget cut, one budget at a time.
Yeah. Well, I think there is no doubt that funding healthcare will be a very prominent political issue in the years ahead after the pandemic. One of the most important pieces of the social contract and one of the most important decisions we make as a society is how much healthcare will we provide to everyone, and where do we draw that line? I'm of the view that there is a minimum that which we should be able to give to everyone, and the WHO has actually defined a minimum that every country should aspire to, a minimum set of preventative healthcare, primary healthcare, vaccinations, and so on, which even the poorest countries should be able to afford, that would cost no more than, let's say, about 5% of GDP. Once you get beyond that minimum, then it becomes a more complicated political question about how much healthcare do we share. And there too, I think it's very revealing where countries draw that line. In the UK, there is a threshold at which the NHS will fund a healthcare intervention if it generates a certain amount of benefit in terms of how many additional healthy years of life it provides. And I think that's a pretty good system. As a country gets richer, it can define that threshold. That threshold can go up as you can afford to offer more. There's some things that healthcare systems don't tend to share. Things like elective sort of cosmetic surgeries, or often dental care is excluded from things you don't share and include in the social contract. But I think the other thing I'd say about the social contract in health is that the pandemic has also shown us very clearly, and we all know this, but healthcare systems are not very good at taking this into account, that prevention is much, much more effective than cure. The pandemic, wearing a mask and washing your hands is a lot easier than getting coronavirus and having to end up in hospital. Obvious point to make. And vaccination is even better, as we are quickly discovering. And so I think the balance of our healthcare systems will move even more, hopefully, toward prevention. And in addition, I think the other thing the virus showed us is that your underlying social conditions can be more important than the healthcare system that you have access to. And so the people who were most vulnerable were people who had, lived in poverty, had obesity and underlying health issues. And those wider social conditions increasingly will determine health outcomes. And frankly, they all have nothing to do with the healthcare system. But if somebody has access to good quality food, gets regular exercise, lives in a place that isn't subject to lots of environmental pollution, even without a very good healthcare system, they're likely to have a very long life. And so I think, again, we need to look again at the social conditions in which we live, the economic and social conditions, what risks we're exposed to in our work and so on, in addition to pouring more money into our healthcare system.
Interesting. Thank you so much. I'm going to start taking questions from our audience, and seeing quite a few already. I'll start with one from Julie, who asks, and I think you sort of touch on this in your introduction, should we concentrate on different values, arts, community, feeding the spirit as well as the body. And I do think you even mentioned famously Bhutan and other countries that seek more complex measures of societal success. There's growing discussion of not only mental health, which you also mention in various parts of the book, but more overall well-being beyond the strict traditional labor approach. And so, yeah, I think it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I think, you know, the sort of old-fashioned economic view was that, you know, the job of government was to increase people's incomes. And I think that is long, you know, a very narrow way of looking at the world. And I think more and more we are looking at broader measures of well-being. And the good thing is that we can measure them now. So statistical offices around the world ask people and survey people regularly on a 1 to 10 scale. How do you feel about your life? Are you satisfied or not? They also ask people questions about community. Do you have a friend nearby who you can call in an emergency? Do you know your neighbors? Those kinds of measures of people's well-being are really important indicators of all sorts of things. One of the, and unfortunately, our politicians haven't gotten clued up that that's what really matters to people. Some very recent research I've seen, which I think should be much more widely publicized, is on how well-being affects voting patterns. So politicians traditionally think, well, people vote their pocketbook. And so if I raise people's income during my tenure, they're going to re-elect me. Actually, a better measure of whether they re-elect you is what happened to your well-being over your tenure. And that's a much better predictor, even controlling for income, of whether people re-elect politicians. And so I very much hope that, and in the book, I talk a lot about how we can use some of these wider measures to measure our progress in society. And a good social contract is about improving well-being, not about increasing GDP.
Right, and that's also more elusive. We have a question from Allison regarding social mobility. And I have to admit, I was fascinated by the research that you include in the book about how many generations it takes to move upwards on that scale. Allison asks, social mobility in the UK, 5 generations to move up. That's quite a lot. How much does ethnic background affect that? Is that something that you've potentially looked into?
Yeah. No, it's a very good question, Alison, and I think there is no doubt that that ethnic background reduces social mobility. People with, you know, ethnicity affects where you start, but also how fast you can move up and down. One of the most interesting pieces of research that I cite looks at what the family you happen to be born into and how that affects your ability to invent and have patents and be innovative. And what it shows that if you're a white boy born into a well-off family, you are 10 times more likely to be an inventor than if you are a poor child born into a minority family. And the title of this research is Lost Einsteins, because what it shows is that even children with absolutely the same, say, maths and science skills in year 4 have those very differential opportunities. And that if we could equalize opportunities so that all children from all ethnic backgrounds and all genders could invent at the same rate as those well-off white boys, we could quadruple the rate of innovation in our economy. That we could, if we could tap into all of that talent. And so that's another big theme. I've talked a lot about insecurity, but another big theme in the book is how do we tap into the talent we have? And social mobility is key for that, giving more opportunities for women to stay in the workforce, tapping into the talent of groups that have historically been excluded from certain professions. If we could do that, we would, I believe, do a huge amount to increase productivity and make all of us better off.
Yeah. I want to switch gears a bit. with a question that's come through an anonymous member of our audience. And we didn't really get a chance to talk about that too much in our introductory discussion. Climate change is changing behaviors, especially among young people. What will the impact of that change be on the social contract? And if I may add, and how does the new social contract prepare us for that?
Well, so I think it's very clear that our intergenerational social contract is broken. For starters, because of what I've described in terms of life prospects, that many young people don't expect to be as well off as their parents. So they don't feel that the livelihoods that they are offered are going to be better than their parents. So that's one problem. The second problem is debt. This next generation is going to inherit quite a legacy of debt based on the huge debt we accumulated to sort out the 2008 financial crisis, and now compounded by the additional debt incurred by COVID. And finally, the environmental legacy that we're leaving behind. If you look at a measure of the stock of the natural world, the sort of total stock of natural capital, biodiversity, forests, animals, etc., that we're leaving the next generation, we have depleted that at a rate which is far in excess of what is optimal. And so we are kind of shortchanging the next generation. And the question is, what can we do about that? I think there are some things that are incredibly obvious. I would start by taking away all the subsidies we provide to people to exploit the environment. So energy subsidies, agricultural subsidies, water subsidies, land subsidies, those come to about $4 to $7 trillion a year, depending on how you measure it. It's a huge amount. It means that not only can you exploit the environment for free, but the taxpayer actually pays you to do it. So that would be step one. Step two would be to tax carbon. And I talk in the book about how that could be done and why that would make sense. And step three is to spend more on conservation and things like planting trees, but also things like preserving wildlife. Who knew that whales actually fix carbon? And the more whales we have and more elephants we have, the more carbon that they fix carbon worth about $1 to $2 million a year. So, we have to look at these nature-based solutions as well. I think if we did that and tried to restore some of the environmental damage that we've done, we would be leaving the next generation a fairer deal. I also think that the older generation has to work longer and retire less early so that we continue to contribute to society longer. Retirement is a 20th century invention. And we've now reached a stage where in advanced economies, people expect to spend a third of their adult life in retirement. And the amount of time that we're working relative to the amount of time that we're retiring is out of balance. And we're not working long enough to be able to support ourselves financially in those later years. And I don't think it's fair to ask the younger generation to pay for the health and pension costs that will come with that. So I think as part of a new intergenerational social contract, we need to look at retirement ages and link them to life expectancy. So as we live longer, we should expect to work a bit longer so that we don't ask young people to carry that responsibility.
I want to stay in the area of work, which is such a big component of the social contract and, of course, your book. In the book, you make a fairly, I would say, calm and convincing case for what effectively is the core of feminism in a lot of ways. And it's a very interesting approach. And I also love the comparisons you make from country to country, in particular, the East versus West German example, which was so different for a country that's now one. We have a question here from Doris, and she says, as more employers are allowing their employees to continue working from home, telework might actually become a bigger feature of our work life. Will this potentially de-skill women or primary caregivers? it's a bit of a curveball in our thinking about women in the workplace and childcare. But I think Doris raises a really interesting question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, Doris, your point is very well taken. I think what we've witnessed during the pandemic is that the burden of caring for children has fallen back primarily onto women, and many women are despairing about what has happened in the last year in terms of lost progress. And you increasingly hear some women, saying, I'm going to give up my career because this is unsustainable. One of the things I do in the book is I talk a lot about the failure of our societies to take advantage of the talent of women and how important that is for productivity and sustaining our societies going forward, but sustaining our pension systems and healthcare systems and so on. And the reason I say we fail to take advantage of the talent is that, today, globally, more women go to university than men. I run a university. I can tell you that in general, we get actually more women than men at the LSE. Globally, the women tend to do a bit better than the men at university, and then they go on and get jobs which are paid the same as men initially. And then as soon as the first child is born, the wage gap opens, and women never recover. Because they tend to move to part-time work or more flexible work, which pays less, they have less experience, they get promoted less often. And until we solve that problem, all of those talented women who are doing unpaid work at home won't be able to contribute through wages and taxes to the rest of society. And on average, globally, women do about 2 hours more unpaid work than men. But that varies enormously, from about 20% more in Norway to about 1,000% more in Pakistan. So this issue about women being the default of where there's unpaid work to be done, it falls to them, is incredibly inefficient for our economies. The IMF has shown that if we could use the talents of all the women, because women bring different skills and if you allocate jobs more efficiently, you could raise GDP by 35%. It's a huge consequence. The issue about working from home actually has the potential to be a solution rather than a problem, because I think we're seeing many more men work from home and discover that it's possible. And I'm hoping that we and many employers use this as an opportunity to enable more parents to work flexibly, both men and women, which might enable more women to stay in the kind of careers that are full-time and long-term, and enable them to close the wage gap that we see in every society.
Thank you. I just want to invite Doris and anyone else who's interested in the impact of the working from home coronavirus nexus on moms, especially to just do an internet search for New York Times Primal Scream. It's an incredibly moving and funny and illuminating piece of work by my colleagues in the US on how women are really suffering in this period of time. We have a great question from Amanda, which kind of ties back to our discussion about transitions after major technological disruptions that affect jobs. Do you think globalization has had a negative impact on the social contract? And do you support a return to localization? That's been a huge discussion in the context of climate change, but also in the context of the pandemic.
Well, I think that the reason globalization adversely affected many parts of society is because the social contract had failed. And I think we can have a social contract that can enable globalization to work better. Let me be a bit more specific. Part of the deal that we've had with business over the last 20 to 30 years, this kind of social contract with business, has been you seek efficiency at all costs, you maximize shareholder value, you outsource your supply chains, you kind of drive down benefits to reduce your wage bill, and you become incredibly efficient. And that has worked, that has produced huge benefits for shareholders and also for consumers, because all of us buy lots of goods a lot more cheaply now than we did before, because of those huge efficiency gains from globalization, outsourcing to China, and so on. But I think we could do it differently. I actually think, global trade and open markets are actually really good for efficiency, and that flexibility has huge benefits. But I also think that we need to accompany it with ways to provide people with security. That's why I think companies should be forced, for example, to pay benefits to all workers, whether they're flexible or not. That's why I think society as a whole needs to spend more on retraining and reskilling people, so that if they are in jobs which are no longer competitive or viable, they're able to move on to jobs that are different. And it is possible. In a country like Denmark, it's a very, very open economy, highly connected to the global trading system. But countries that are very, very open need to spend a lot more on these active labor market policies to provide unemployment insurance and training, so that when people are displaced, they know that they'll be looked after. And so I guess I would argue for globalization with a better social contract, so we can benefit from the efficiencies, but at the same time, we will look after people so that they can move on to whatever the new opportunities are in the future.
Julie gives me the opportunity to ask a question I should have asked myself, because it's such an important part of your book. What do you think about the universal basic income?
Yes, yeah. So I am a little bit of a skeptic on universal basic income, and I'll tell you why. Because I should say there are a few cases where I think it's legitimate. So for example, I've worked in many developing countries, in very low income countries, where a large proportion of the population is very poor, and you can transfer very small amounts of money to households directly through mobile banking, to make sure that kind of minimum nutrition and incomes are maintained. And that I think is completely fine. But I think in most advanced economies, we can do better than that. We can do better than just give everybody the same check and end up having to tax people a lot and transfer a lot of money to richer people who don't need it. We can target. And so I would instead argue for mechanisms that maintain a minimum for people, that no one should have to go below a certain level. And we can define what that is as a society. And if people don't earn that much to maintain a decent standard of living, we should top up their incomes. And the other thing I would say is that, I think work is an important part of the social contract. And I think everyone has something to contribute. And, in every society, you're expected to contribute when you're an adult and be looked after when you're young and you're old. And I think universal basic income kind of denies the value of work. And so in that sense, I'm a little bit of a skeptic, except for in a certain set of cases. I think the other issue that we have to acknowledge is that for it to be meaningful, for it to be a meaningful universal basic income, you have to raise taxes a lot. And I think the viability of that is going to be very, very difficult. And so if you're just going to give people a small amount, I'm not sure it makes enough difference. And what I'd rather do is give that significant amount to really poor households, rather than just giving everybody a small amount.
I think I can squeeze in two more questions. One's coming from Lars. He says, I'm curious to know which industries you have found to be the most resistant to change.
Ooh, it's an interesting question. Industries resistant to change.
Lars, you've got us thinking here.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because, okay, spoiler alert, on the famous table of professions that may be becoming slightly obsolete in future, you mention, among others, sort of broader profession of accounting. And I thought, here's an industry that's been incredibly resistant to change. All those jobs that are, of course, white collar, but have sort of had really minimal disruption in terms of the last probably 50 years at least.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. I mean, it is interesting that that is what will be very different about this next technological set of changes that we face. We have sort of got used to the idea of automation affecting manufacturing and robots taking over factories and so on. We haven't got as used to the idea of lawyers and architects and accountants being replaced by automation. And yet increasingly that is the case. For not for everything, and that's why I keep saying jobs will change. The bits that are routine and repetitive are the bits that will be automated. In many ways, that's probably no bad thing, because those are the boring bits of most jobs. And the creative bits are the ones that will remain. I sometimes say, again, I'm speaking very loosely, but in the past, jobs were about muscles. And at the moment, jobs are about brains. And in the future, they're going to be more about the heart and kind of emotional intelligence and creativity. And so I guess in terms of Lars's question, probably the jobs that are most resistant to change are the ones that are, my instinctive answer is ones that are geographically isolated, because it's very difficult and it goes to the whole issue about place and jobs around things like mining or extractive industries or single company towns. Those are the most difficult, because when you have one industry dominating a locale, it's very hard to imagine what could replace it.
Sure. So it's more about the way it's organized than the subject matter per se necessarily. So final question, and I hope it doesn't send you into an existential spiral. Julie asks, Valerie asks, how likely do you think it is that your recommendations will be implemented?
Oh, great question. So, I think we're at a critical juncture. And the combination of our kind of politics of the moment and the pandemic mean that people want something different. And in these moments in history, when you look back in history, things can go both ways. I'm very aware of that. You look back at, we've had critical junctures where things got better. So when the Great Depression happened, we had the New Deal. When World War II happened, we had beverage and a modern new welfare state. But we've also had periods in history when things didn't get better. After World War I, not much was resolved, and we ended up getting World War II. After the 2008 financial crisis, we tinkered with some improvements in financial regulation, but we didn't fundamentally change our economic system. And we ended up getting the populist backlash that we saw for the last decade. So at critical junctures, things can go both ways. One of the most interesting surveys that I've seen recently was done in, I think, 24 countries. And they surveyed people before the pandemic and after. And what they found was that after the pandemic, people were more afraid and they felt let down by society. That's bad. But they also, because they'd been deprived of human contact for so long, they also felt more valuing of community and equality and social interactions. And I think if we tap into those feelings that people have at this moment, there is an opportunity for real change. I think it will take chipping away. And I'm hoping that my book is a modest contribution, because I think it's much easier to get change when there are some ideas around that are potential solutions. But in my experience, I've worked in policymaking roles for about 25 years. And in my practical experience, what ends up happening when big reforms happen is that you have a crisis, and then there's a window of opportunity that opens up. And whatever good ideas are around at that moment, that's what people do, because it's a crisis and we must do something. And so I guess in my heart, I'm hoping that we are at one of those moments when there is a window of opportunity in many countries and people want something different after this extraordinary period that we've lived in. And I'm hoping that some of the ideas in my book will be some of the ideas that people say, aha, here's a potential solution that can give us a better society and a better social contract.
Yeah, it's I suppose always about the sense of urgency around it, given the short-termism of political election cycles and the longer term view that people like you take and are able to offer. I want to thank you so much for your time and for this great conversation. Thank you to our audience for the excellent questions. Just a reminder that on the Hay Festival website, you can buy this book, you can donate to the Hay Festival, and you can register for next month's Book of the Month, which is, I think the event is going to be on the 27th of April, Male Tears. Thanks everyone very, very much for joining us tonight, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you, Martina, and thank you, everyone.